Do atheists make themselves their own God? Welcome to Philosopher's Corner. I'm John. Do atheists make themselves their own God? I think it's a fair question to ask, or it's like philosophical territory that is fair to explore. We have this set of thinkers called atheists, and their primary context on life is that there is no God, that there is no creator of the universe, that there is no embodiable supreme intelligence, infinite intelligence, source of the reality that we're in, that there is no design to it, that there is no intention to it, that essentially there's no spiritual force animating any of it. The traditional orthodox atheist viewpoint is that life is essentially only the material matter that we see, and that it may have overtones of other energies that can be 100% explained by science and physics as nothing more than physics. And that absolutely everything that we can see in the reality, including helicopters flying overhead, and that absolutely every single event in reality, ranging from you falling in love to the birth of your children, to the tax man, to a beautiful sunset, literally anything that you might hold near and dear as a human experience, something that touches your soul, which in this particular scenario may not even truly exist in the way that you think it does, is completely devoid of any spiritual energy. In their mind, God simply does not exist. And so that's the traditional orthodox atheist view, is that life is simply random matter that coincidentally has produced experiences, and essentially it has no merit other than the physics involved. So the real question when we talk about atheists philosophically is, if that is the base viewpoint for going through life, that there is no God, does that create a power vacuum in which they view themselves as God? Because if God does not exist, then there still has to be whatever the most intelligent thing is that they know. So is this a cheap way of them proclaiming themselves to be God? Is essentially the philosophical question. Because even atheists admit that they are sentient. And so if we look at reality from an atheistic point of view, where it's all just matter smashing into itself and producing, just through sheer probability, events that essentially have no meaning because there's no context to it. The only context to it is that things are just randomly smashing around like billiard balls on an infinite pool table. There's no spiritual energy to it. There's no design to it. There's no intelligence latent to it. But there still are analytical ways to view this godless reality, which means there still is a hierarchy of intelligence. Now, it's not infinite intelligence. It's simply intelligence of these sentient beings who are placed into this sort of billiard ball scenario, and you can still measure up the relative intelligence of the different beings. Atheists don't discount the fact that there are other human beings, and they don't discount the fact that there are other people having experiences within this godless realm. They just say that there's no supreme intelligence to any of it, and that nobody was created out of any sort of either benevolence or malevolence to exist in this creation. It's just all purely probabilistic. But even within that scenario, you can still rank the intelligence of other sentient beings without having any sort of spiritual analysis. And so, by removing any idea of a higher intelligence that exists outside of the physical reality, within the confines of what now is a seemingly, well, in the finite world of other sentient beings, there's clearly a hierarchy of intelligence within it. So for an atheist, does that mean that another sentient being that is more intelligent than them, is a god to them? Does that mean if they just meet one person who's clearly smarter than them, then that person, by definition, if they have a higher understanding of the reality, or they have more access to the information and context of the reality in which we exist, is that person now a god to them? And if that person is not a god to them, why are they not a god to them? Now that they've created this intellectual power vacuum in which there is no supreme intelligence in the universe, there still is a hierarchy of intelligence. There still is a hierarchy of power. And so what labels do atheists place on these people? Like, how do they describe the fact that there are still other sentient beings, regardless of spiritual existence, who know more than them, are more intelligent than them, have the ability to, in many scenarios, manipulate their environment, cause them to think a certain way, can completely control the context of their entire lives? Many atheists go from cradle to grave having been manipulated and having their entire lives dictated without them even knowing by sentient beings who are magnitudes more intelligent than them. So in the power vacuum that they create with their ideology known as atheism, what label do they put on these sentient beings who have completely controlled their lives, completely determined the paths of their lives, and in most cases, the atheistic believer having never identified who that individual is, or groups of other sentient beings who are expressly and consciously controlling that person's life and the way they think and the way they breed and the way they do everything in their life. So what label are they left with to put onto these people in this very finite world that they've created, where there's no afterlife, they don't know where they came from, they're simply just popped up in the reality, and now they're just dealing with a bunch of vibrating atoms? So how do they label people who are better at the reality than them, to an extent that they exhibit godlike powers over their lives? Now, maybe they don't use the term godlike. Maybe they don't use the term God at all for somebody who can manipulate their reality, which, aside from spiritual analysis, would seem to be the proper label for somebody who can have a nearly all-encompassing control over your life. And given the power vacuum they create by saying that there is no supreme intelligence or infinite intelligence or any sort of permeating spiritual energy or anything that goes throughout the time and space, and even if they do identify it, that it has nothing to do with them in particular, because that any sort of like higher intelligence interest in an individual really can only be described as God. So here they are, just out in this dire, dark, finite world that has no meaning, no context, no intelligence, no benevolence, yet they're in this world with other beings who have considerably more power and intelligence than them and are manipulating their lives, or at least affecting their lives to a high degree of magnitude. So what do they call those people, right? And philosophically, let's say you are one of those people who is an atheist and you have that amount of power over everybody, and let's say you're the smartest atheist on the planet for philosophical debate, and you've excluded the existence of God, you've excluded the existence of spiritual energy, you're determined that you are 100% correct in your analysis, that this is it, there's nothing more, you don't know where you came from, you don't know where you're going, and you have a tremendous amount of power over other sentient beings on the planet. what label do you give yourself? And like, what other label could you give yourself other than God? If you have determined that you are the most powerful being in your reality, let's say you're the most powerful being in the whole world, statistically, analytically, let's say you are pulling the strings on the entire planet of beings, and you have excluded the idea that any sort of higher power exists, what other label could you give yourself other than God? And is that the ideology that every atheist secretly harbors in their mind? And is that a thing that affects their behavior? Is that why they are quick to, would that lead a person to maintaining that worldview in a manner in which they exclude other more intelligent sentient beings, or they exclude all logical demonstrations and proofs of anything other than a highly probabilistic, godless world that is only run by physics and explained by essentially nothing, in order to preserve a personal power vacuum? And how do they label all of the other hierarchies of power and sentience that exist outside of any sort of spiritual analysis? What are the explanations for the fact that they are not the most powerful person in their reality? Now, in terms of specific atheistic ideologies, they are typically encouraging themselves to do power grabs. Is like when you boil all the atheistic arguments down, they come down to some sort of self-empowerment combined with like what they explain as like some sort of secular moral code that they call ethics, that has no context and has no authority to it. It's simply a utilitarian set of ethics of get along, da 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 da, but only out of like theory, and it's always self-serving. At the end of the day, the entire code of ethics is it's self-serving because there is no repercussion for anything other than what comes back to the individual. And so in that way, it's very easy to cherry pick your environments. It's very easy to sort of cultivate what's going on in the environment so that the feedback fits the ideology, which is a hallmark of any ideology, really. That's why ideologies are so dangerous, because they are the confirmation bias. So I guess that leads us to the question, is atheism simply nothing more than a confirmation bias for individual validation? Because can an atheist admit that, can they admit they're dumb? And that there's like a bunch of other, even if it's just a world full of atheists, can they admit that there's just a bunch of other atheists who are way smarter and more powerful than them that are going to control their lives anyway? Is that a spot they can get to? Or is it a full-blown ideology that is a traditional confirmation bias that essentially acts as a mental blockage to the full spectrum of reality? It's a traditional question when it comes to atheism. Have they come up with an ideology simply to place themselves as God? Which in the overall discussion of these types of things is kind of hilarious, because most schools of thought in spirituality try to connect people to source energy or God in order to achieve the same effect, but in reverence to the context that the universe was created by a supreme intelligence. But generally speaking, it all comes back to self-empowerment and individual validation, and has an aim at a high degree of self-empowerment. So it's funny to me as a philosopher that the atheistic view, which is ultimately about, empowering self and telling the person like, yeah, you're in a highly probabilistic but non-spiritual universe, so empower yourself with that knowledge to have more confidence and clarity and security moving through the world. That's general broad strokes, obviously, but it's the same sort of aim that most spiritual teachings lead you to, except the spiritual teachings actually have a collectivist set of ethics. right? It's not just a simple individual utilitarian type of ethics, which I think that's amusing. That they're kind of like going for the same thing, but one side has a much different context than the other. So, yeah. So, do atheists are they doing? Does it make them their own god? You make up your own mind. To me, it seems like it does, unless the atheist admits that other just smarter, more intelligent atheists than them are basically their gods, in the sense that a god is someone that has a unwitting influence over their life and has powers over their life that they have no control over, and they sort of get dictated to. I don't know. It's philosophy. You're allowed to just have a discussion about it. Anyway, thanks for spending some time here at Philosopher's Corner. I hope you found it helpful. And as always, have fun.